When we left last week, we were up to 1778, and while that sounds like that's only 2 years of the war, and it is technically only 2 years of the war, the earlier years, of course, are the years that we're going to be fighting more intensely. We had last week talked about the Battle of Saratoga, and I think as we were leaving, I had mentioned the fact that Saratoga, aside from it being a victory for the American colonists, the Revolutionary War patriots, that it is really significant for us in American history because it is Saratoga that gives pause to those who were watching what was going on here in the American colonies. You know, nowhere truly in the history of mankind, nowhere had there been that sort of an uprising by colonists, an evolution, probably more so than a revolution since it took us a while to get there, but an evolution into a conflict between colonies and a mother country. So Europe was watching. Of particular significance, of course, was France, and the battle at Saratoga will determine that France will indeed come in on our side, because while France loved our ideas of liberty and equality and the fact that we were using some of the French enlightened philosophers, they also had been going through a series of conflicts with England. So as we love to say in history, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that sort of made us our partner. So let's jump into the end of 1778 today, and we're going to take the war to the frontier a little bit with a name that probably most of you have heard, but may not really know why you've heard about him. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about George Rogers Clark. How many of you have heard of George Rogers Clark? Little brother is William, who is part of Lewis and Clark. And it's interesting because probably more people know who he is than they do George Rogers Clark. Well, and maybe it's because I have an affection for those who were on the frontier, but George Rogers is born in Albemarle County in Virginia, and he's a surveyor. And as a young man, he's surveying the land that what today would be Kentucky. Remember that originally with the colonies, those that were not paying attention to the proclamation of 1763, it's just as much of what is Tennessee today was part of North Carolina. In fact, some of the early records, for those of you doing genealogy and looking at Sumner County and looking even some of Jackson County and some of those across the center of the state, there are actually records in North Carolina from when those counties were North Carolina, because it was that way until, of course, we become a state. So anyway, Clark is born in Virginia. Virginia extends all the way to claim much of what is Kentucky today. He's a surveyor out there on the frontier. He had been actively engaged in a lot of the fighting in the 1760s between the native people on the frontier and the settlers in some of those land disputes as we're beginning to move westward. When the American Revolution breaks out, much of the defense of the frontier will fall to the state militias. I mean, the truth of the matter is the Continental Army simply did not have enough men to be able to protect the ports, protect the major forts of the 13 colonies, and at the same time be engaged in conflicts that were going to occur out on the frontier, out kind of beyond the mountains, beyond the Alleghenies, beyond the Appalachians in that area. So most of the defense of those areas are going to fall to what are the state militias. And many of you who are listening to this probably had, if you go back and look at records of Revolutionary War soldiers, you may actually see where someone in your family tree served in the North Carolina militia, served in the Virginia militia, as opposed to their record saying Continental line. And that's sort of that difference. Well, George Rogers Clark took it on himself to raise troops and to organize campaigns against the British and against the native, because remember, the majority of the Native Americans are fighting on the side of the British, even still at this point in what would have been considered the Northwest Territory at that point. And that's the region that will become the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. So to make it legitimate, William Rogers Clark is commissioned by the Virginia governor, who happened to be a man by the name of Patrick Henry. So Clark will lead Virginia militia out onto that northwest frontier and will begin the fight against the British, who have forts in that area, and actually sort of enacting revenge against the natives in that area because they'd been running raids against the settlers. With barely 150 men, and I think about that sometimes, 150 men, George Rogers Clark basically captures the entire Northwest Territory, capturing several territories, several posts, primarily so successful primarily in being able to do that, that he convinces at this point a lot of the French-speaking people who are still in that region to support the Patriots. So not only does Saratoga bring some of the French-speaking to our side, but so does what George Rogers Clark is doing out there on the frontier. He becomes known as the conqueror of the old Northwest. I love when Michigan and Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio are the Northwest. We didn't see ahead in the looking glass. What's interesting is after the war, Clark is left penniless. He has financed that movement while he was given that rank by the Virginia governor. Virginia didn't supply any of the funds for the militia, and George Rogers Clark had funded the entire campaign out of his own money, and he actually will die impoverished, having supported the American Revolution. But it's a major successful sort of thing. So that's occurring primarily May to December 1778. From 1779 until 1781, a lot of the emphasis in the American Revolution is going to be on the Southern campaign. So for those of us who are familiar with some of those battles and probably had ancestors, we're going to kind of walk through them very quickly. May of 1780, Charleston falls to the British, and that siege of Charleston was considered to be probably the worst defeat for the colonists during the American Revolution. 8 months later, at Camden in 1780, again, the British will be victorious, and it introduces someone into American history and American folklore, also a British major by the name of Patrick Ferguson. And Ferguson had been given two real requests. He was to recruit loyalists. The South was sort of divided for a period of time between those who, especially those who had an Anglican background. They felt a certain amount of loyalty, where the Scots and the Irish predominantly, we'd been just sort of waiting for another reason to be mad at England. That was in our DNA probably most often. But he will be given two charges: one, to recruit for the British Army loyalists, or at least loyalists who would form their own militia. And then he was given the task of protecting, as Cornwallis was going to move through the Carolinas, he was to protect the left flank, which would keep Nathaniel Greene and others in the American Revolutionary Continental line from attacking. Nickname is Bulldog. You always have this image when you hear that somebody's nickname is Bulldog. But what he will do is that he's going to come up against the over the mountain men. Any of you on here have ancestors who were over the mountain men? Some of you may have. We can do your genealogy and find out, but what you're going to find is those are soldiers out here on the frontier, many of them coming out of what will eventually be Tennessee and Kentucky. Huge group of them are going to come out of Northeast Tennessee, Elizabethton, what today would be Jonesboro, Bristol, all the way up in that area where Sycamore Shoals is. But I do have a quote here, and I wanted to read it to you because Light Horse Harry Lee, who is, of course, the grandfather of Robert E. Lee, actually the father of Robert E. Lee, and the son of Richard Henry Lee, will refer to the over the mountain men as, and this is his quote, "a race of hardy men who, very familiar with the use of the horse and the rifle, stout, active people who under privation were notoriously brave." The British didn't necessarily see the over the mountain men the same way. In fact, Ferguson in his journals will refer to them as, and this is a quote from him, "more savage than the Indians." On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm not exactly certain where he's putting the over the mountain frontier men compared to the Native Americans. But anyway, Ferguson goes into the campaign here in the Carolinas with the assumption that 50% of the population is loyalist, and he's going to be able to convince them to fight on the side of the British. Now, he miscalculates that. And he probably miscalculated what was going to happen, because he issued a proclamation. He had it printed out and he sent it to all the major population centers. And in that proclamation, he said that if you do not desist, and I want to read you this quote because it's the sort of thing that all of us will probably identify with. He said, if you do not desist from your opposition to British arms, he would, quote, march over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay your country to waste with fire and sword. Thinking that making such a proclamation that would be hung on, every public, on a tree in every public courthouse yard, that everybody on the frontier would go, oh, woe is me. He's going to hang us from the trees and he's going to burn all of our crops and burn our homes and everything. And what he did not realize was the nature of the population on the frontier. And we know this from now going back and looking at the records of the battles and everything. It was sort of like being told, you will desist and desist. And the folks on the frontier were sort of like, watch me. It was a challenge. So October the 7th, just, not but 2 weeks or so ago, 1780, Ferguson and the over the mountain men met in what many people at the time would have thought would have been an insignificant battle, but it becomes a major significant battle in the War for Independence. Took place on a rocky hilltop in western South Carolina, and it's called Kings Mountain. Any of you been to Kings Mountain? Yay, I was there in fact, the week after Christmas last year, I was there with one of my girlfriends, and the mountain's not really a significant mountain, but we're hiking up the mountain, and she said, I just don't know that I would have gone to all the trouble to hike up a mountain to have a battle. I might have just gone around the bottom of it and gone on home. So, and I explained to her that she would not have made a great patriot, that was not exactly how they decided. People took high grounds, and there was a technical reason for that. But anyway, the battle at Kings Mountain ends up being the Loyalists are going to be defeated. It's the first major setback in Britain's southern strategy, and it starts this sort of chain of events that ultimately will lead to Cornwallis surrendering at Yorktown. So just real quickly, kind of what happens, early afternoon battle, over the mountain men are creeping, sorry, I have to act it out, are creeping up quietly toward where Ferguson and his men are when the first shots ring out. And Ferguson deploys his loyalists to the center of the hilltop. The remaining ones will mount. He mounts up, personally leads the counterattack. They fire volleys. There's some back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, but the battle becomes fierce, absolutely fierce. In fact, one of the loyalists later will refer to the over the mountain men as looking like devils from the innermost regions of hell, with their yelling and screaming and the whole antics that they will use in the combat. Ferguson and his men find themselves surrounded, and their counterattack just fails. What really is interesting is as the perimeter is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, Ferguson tries to lead his men away. He's mounted on horseback, and he becomes the perfect target. He will be shot multiple times, and his mount will flee Kings Mountain, but Ferguson's body will be dangling from the horse as he flees. And it becomes one of those things that British soldiers will later talk about as being the moment when they knew all was lost, because he has left the battlefield and they are left alone. The loyalists at that point will surrender. The American riflemen had been victorious, but it was a costly battle. I read a report not long ago when I was doing research for someone who had an ancestor at Kings Mountain. And in this person's report, when in 1818 they came back and they offered pensions to those who had served in the American Revolution, well, this gentleman had filed his report, and he had talked about looking to the left, looking to the right, the piles of dead on the ground, the number of people that he knew. And he said, in his words, it took all the strength he had, not simply to just stand and weep, but he knew that he had to, the forces had to retreat from the battlefield and then eventually follow the British. So, I mean, that idea of having gone through that sort of battle and then shedding tears. Next major battle that occurs will occur the following January, and that occurs at Cowpens. And a lot of the folks who fought at Kings Mountain will also fight at Cowpens. One of my ancestors is at Cowpens, but he's not at Kings Mountain. He's an older, out of South Carolina, and I guess he just didn't get to Kings Mountain in time. But at Cowpens, you've got the Continental soldiers and the local Patriot militia together under General Daniel Morgan. And Daniel Morgan is one of those wonderful names, often overlooked in the American Revolutionary history. And they're fighting against Bannister Tarleton, who is sort of one of those British leaders that everybody goes, Tarleton, terrible, terrible guy. But Cowpens is a victory for the American Revolutionary forces, and it begins to convince the worried patriots that the British are not as strong as they thought they were in the South. It also begins to make the British think the same thing. March of 1781, Guilford Courthouse, and Guilford Courthouse is North Carolina, close to where today Greensboro is. It's a costly victory for the British. They are victorious there, but it is really, really costly. And the battle was part of Nathaniel Greene's strategy of beginning to engage the British on ground of his choosing. He wanted to be able to pick and choose to have the upper hand in determining where the armies would come together. And he chooses Guilford Courthouse because of its location. It's considered to be a British victory. It's not a clear-cut victory, but it does, the aftermath of the battle at Guilford Courthouse, what you'll find Nathaniel Greene's army doing is a lot of wearing the British down with hit and run, what today we would call guerrilla warfare tactics. From there, the only other battle between Guilford Courthouse and Yorktown that probably you may have heard of, or you may not have, and it's just a fun one to know, is a battle called 96. 96 is a battle that occurs in South Carolina, and it's an unusual star-shaped fort situation, isolated British garrison shaped like a star, and it's the colonial forces lay siege under Nathaniel Greene, and the British relief column actually comes in, but it leads Greene to make a final, somewhat unsuccessful assault on the fort. But the events that occur at 96 convince the British that they have too few troops to hold the Carolinas in particular, and they will begin to pull back out of South Carolina, North Carolina, and back into Virginia, which sets the stage for our final battle of the American Revolution that most all of us need to know, and that's the battle at Yorktown. The battle at Yorktown is one of those almost perfect moments in military history where you have the Continental Army on land coming in. You know, Yorktown is out on the peninsula of the James River. A lot of you probably have been to Jamestown, to Yorktown, to that area of Virginia along the James River. And you have the U.S. Continental forces coming in. The British are backed to the peninsula, and then Rochambeau, who is helping Washington there, French general who's helping with the land forces, but of course the French Navy is out in the water, and the Navy comes in, and you find the British caught in a vice, which is always a wonderful thing to happen if it happens to your enemy and you're part of the vice. And it is there that General Cornwallis is going to be forced to surrender, and it becomes ultimately, there will be smaller skirmishes afterwards. This happens in 1791. The peace treaty will not occur until 1793, but for all intents and purposes, the American Revolution is over, and much to the chagrin of the British, this upstart ragtag group of revolutionaries has won. And it is no mistake that as Cornwallis comes out, for the British Army to surrender, that the British Army, their music group, their drummers and their pipers, play The World Turned Upside Down, because in their mind, how in the world could the British be defeated by these savages on the frontier? So it's kind of fascinating. The other thing, of course, is that Cornwallis will not surrender his sword himself, because he does not want to present it to Washington, because he doesn't think Washington is worthy of accepting his sword. And there's this whole foofla over how the surrender will occur. And of course, Washington, one of the things that I love about Washington is Washington is quite magnanimous. He can afford to be. He's just defeated the British Army, or at least he is the picture of the American revolutionaries that have defeated the army. Interestingly, until the peace treaty is signed in 1793, though, New York City and Charleston, South Carolina will both stay in British hands. So lots of prisoner of war ships that will be in Charleston Harbor with American revolutionaries on those ships until the end of the war. And some of you may very well have had ancestors that were aboard some of those prisoners of war ships. Side note real quickly, and then I will move on to the aftermath of what happens, is that Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson, who was Andrew Jackson's mother, fascinating woman. The Jacksons are in the Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina. Both Carolinas like to claim Andrew. We, of course, say he's from Tennessee, except when we don't want to claim him for certain actions that we don't approve of. But anyway, Andrew Jackson's oldest brother, Hugh, will be killed in battle early on. His father has died when he's young. Second brother will be captured and will be taken aboard a prisoner of war ship in Charleston. Andrew Jackson himself will, of course, have a quite famous run-in with one of the British officers that orders Jackson as a young boy, 11, 12, 13. We're not sure of Jackson's age, to shine his boots, and Jackson refuses to. And of course, Jackson will wear the scar across his face the rest of his life, where the British officer banishes his saber and cuts Jackson to the bone. But anyway, Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson will go to South Carolina, strong woman, widow, having already lost one son, one in a prisoner of war, youngest son, having already been maimed in some way by the British, will walk all the way to Charleston, and she will negotiate the release of a number of the prisoners that were from the Waxhatch, which was the area that her family was from. And as she is walking those boys, and for the most part they were young soldiers, walking them back, she takes the fever and dies. So Jackson, of course, has only a memory of her up through his teens, and then she dies. But it's sort of a fascinating story with those prisoner of war ships. So American Revolution, the fighting is over. General Washington has been proclaimed the hero. So what happens sort of in the aftermath of the battle, and then ultimately the surrender at Yorktown? Well, one of the things that's really fascinating is that about 100,000 American colonists who had remained loyal to the crown exit the 13 colonies right at that point, most of them moving north into Canada. A few will go back to Europe, but many of them will go into Canada. A few will go to the British West Indies. And among those, that 100,000 or so who will leave are about 15,000 African Americans who had sided with the British also, because they had been promised not only freedom, but they were promised that Britain would help them in resettling to a location that would be their own. That group of fleeing African Americans will actually end up eventually, part of them being the founders of Sierra Leone. They will strike an agreement with the French government. So that whole change of things. Now, the peace treaty is signed September the 3rd, 1783. It's the Peace of Paris. Of course, if you're going to negotiate a peace treaty, let's get all the warring parties together. Someplace that's a fun place to sign a treaty. Nobody wants to sign a treaty in Chattanooga, Tennessee, or for that matter, some backwoods place in the Carolinas. So the warring parties, the representatives, will come together in Paris. And when it's all over, in the simplest of terms, the United States comes into existence. The colonies are free. They are given the land all the way to the Mississippi. But, and Canada will be a separate province remaining under control of the British. But the truth of the matter is, it will take a second war to really make the world certainly know that the American Revolution wasn't a fluke. And that's why the War of 1812 is often called the Second Great American Revolution. So now, when war began, we had the Second Continental Congress. Basically, they were the ones that had issued the Olive Branch Petition. They were trying to make peace. They were the ones, of course, that had done the Declaration of Independence. It's the Second Continental Congress that had chosen George Washington to be commander-in-chief. So even while the war is being executed, there had to be some sort of governance situation. Somebody has to be in charge. There has to be some way. Now, governing at that point was, I won't say relatively easy, but of course, the number one thing on everyone's mind was, are we going to be able to succeed in this war against the British? And if we don't, as Franklin said, we will all surely hang together. So we have the Articles of Confederation actually come into existence in 1777 at Philadelphia. They will be ratified, but they really don't go into effect until 1781. And that's because no one was interested in courts at that point. They weren't particularly interested in a legislative body. Second Continental Congress is the legislative body. So 1781, everybody looks around and goes, we're not really fighting anymore. We're independent. Well, what in the world do we do now? It's kind of like that dog chasing the car, and the car stops, and you lots of times will see the dog look, and it's sort of like, well, that wasn't what I was expecting. So Articles of Confederation are ratified in 1781. But the truth of the matter is, they're only going to be in effect for 6 years, and that's because they really were dismal. They were a failure. The first attempt, you're going to find that the founding fathers, and I'll put the blame on the founding fathers because the mothers were not there to vote. The founding fathers were so leery of too much power being put in the hands of a centralized government because of their experience at the hands of the British. Now, part of that was, yes, the strong power of Parliament. Part of that was the fact it was an absentee landlord. So there's a little bit of both. So Articles of Confederation come into existence 1791. Probably the simplest way to explain it is the inherent weakness is the fact that it's a confederacy. Those of us who have studied the American Civil War know that when the Southern states withdraw, the first 7 in December of 1860, the other 4 that will withdraw after the firing on Fort Sumter, that government that is created first at Montgomery and then moved to Richmond will be a confederacy. And there's a reason for that. That was the South's distrust of strong central government, much like the founding fathers. A confederacy, in simplest terms, puts the power in the hands of the states. So when you hear people talk about sovereign states, you may hear the phrase sovereign nation of sovereign states. That's federalism. That's a balance of power between the two. But when you talk about sovereign states, well, that's a confederation. And the Articles of Confederation very specifically in Article 2 of the Articles basically said all power resides in the states. Now, why is that a flaw? Well, it's a flaw in so many ways. So let me walk you through some things real quickly, and I'm going to try and do this so we have some time to maybe talk a little bit about it. Economically, it's just the most disorganized thing in the world. If you think about, think about if you were trying to maintain your financial records, whether you're a business or you're a home, and you've got things in so many different locations, and you don't know what one group is doing and another group doing. For the emerging United States, it's just a huge struggle because, one, the new nation has debt. There were those individual patriots during the time of the Revolution who loaned significant amounts of money to Second Continental Congress to finance the war. People like Robert Livingston, who was on the Declaration of Independence Committee from New York, wealthy banker out of New York, loans lots and lots of money. There were numbers of patriots from most of the colonies who put their personal fortunes in with the understanding from the Second Continental Congress that they would be repaid when the war was over. Well, the problem is that when the Revolutionary War is over, because let's say Robert Livingston's money went to support the New York militia. The New York militia is vital at Saratoga, the defense of New York, Long Island, all those sorts of things. But when it's all over, because you've got a nation of sovereign states, they couldn't figure out how to pay their bills. I'm in South Carolina. I'm not particularly interested in paying Robert Livingston back. Not only that, but Congress couldn't regulate trade. There were different rules about poundage. There, in fact, different coins. Each state was minting its own money and using that money. So the exchange rate, it would be like traveling in Europe today and having no set valuation for the money. It was just wow. States could set any trade restrictions that they wanted to. The only thing that the states could not do related to trade and commerce and interaction even with foreign countries, docking of ships, all that sort of thing. The only thing that the states couldn't do is they could not make treaties with foreign nations. Everything else, they're negotiating on their own. All of these trade policies. So the French are trading with Virginia under different guidelines than the French are trading with New York. Just think about how absolutely incredibly crazy that all is. Each state has its own agenda. Because of that no uniformity when it comes to currency, obviously, it's just so inefficient and it's so ineffective. And the big one is only the states could tax. Only the states had the authority to impose a tax and to raise revenue. And as a result, the Continental Congress, which is running the war and then will actually be the legislative body following the end of the war and into the time of the Constitution, they can't levy taxes. So they can't fund any programs that they want to run or anything. They can send out a request to the states for funding. But the problem is, I'm in Pennsylvania and I'm interested in funding one particular program, but I'm not interested in funding another. And each state would decide on their own which they were going to fund. So there's no uniformity, no ability to raise taxes. In addition to that, there's a lack of leadership. There's no independent judiciary. There's no court system under the Articles of Confederation. Everything is state court. When we get to our US Constitution, we're going to see there's a clear delineation between the role of the federal courts versus the state courts. And of course, there are federal courts housed in states, but they are very different courts and they have very clearly defined differences of where they sit in judgment, how they adjudicate the cases that come before them. It's very clearly delineated. Nothing. Where is that a real problem? Well, let's say that there's a disagreement between two of the new states over a boundary. There's no place to go with that. Virginia says the boundary is here, North Carolina says the boundary is here, and there's no unbiased party that can settle that dispute. And so often what would happen is you'd have a knockdown, drag out fight, truly physical, a fight over certain issues, especially boundaries. In addition, we have no person in charge of foreign affairs, no single person, where today, Secretary of State, that is our global ambassador. The Secretary of State becomes the face of the United States who travels, who is involved in negotiation of treaties, trade agreements, all that international interaction. The Articles of Confederation had no one. There was no diplomacy, and it's kind of hard to imagine even in the 1780s having no diplomatic corps. I mean, we had had a diplomatic corps during the actual fighting of the revolution, but the Continental Congress had identified certain people who would go negotiate things. There also is no real ability to deal with any internal or external threats. So only the Continental Congress had the power to make peace and make war, but they didn't have the authority to raise an army. You know, you kind of have to go, how quickly did we write this document and how quickly did we all agree to it? So Continental Congress can make war, they can make peace, but they can't raise an army. Each state then had to supply. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state had to supply troops that would be fighting. So it's state militia dependent on state troops. But that really becomes an issue. And I will tell you where it terribly becomes an issue is that following the American Revolution, you're going to have an uprising out on the frontier, out sort of in Pennsylvania's backwoods, and Shays' Rebellion. And it really occurs, it's one of those uprisings. It occurs in 1786, and I'm convinced, I think most historians are convinced, that Shays' Rebellion really leads to people going, oh, for the love of heaven, we can't do anything. We've got to rewrite our government, because what happens is, you know, there's a tremendous depression following the war. Soldiers who have been off fighting the war have not been home working their fields. They haven't been selling their crops, and their land is being taken for taxes by the states. Well, these soldiers are angry. I've been off fighting in the defense of my nation, and because I wasn't here to be able to make money by whatever my trade was, now you're going to take my land, you're going to turn my family out. And there's this huge rebellion that occurs, and they begin to protest first peacefully against the collection of those taxes. But however, as it becomes more evident that several of the states are not going to, Pennsylvania in this case, are not going to forgive those taxes, it becomes militant. And it took a group of rich merchants from across several of the new states to pool money to be able to then go in and pay the taxes of these soldiers who are about to lose their land, to stop the rebellion. But that's not how you normally stop rebellions. Normally you have, you know, the commander-in-chief will call out forces and you can do something, but they couldn't do that. The final things with the Articles of Confederation was just the way in which legislatively they could or could not do things. Each state had one vote. Per Article 5 of the Articles of Confederation, it said each state has one vote. As a result, small states and large states had an equal weight when it came to actions of the Continental Congress. So there was no proportionality in it all. And, you know, you hear today, let's do away with electoral college, let's do away with the weighting of larger states and smaller states. Well, it was an issue even during the time of the Articles of the Confederation, but let me give you an example. So Virginia, in 1780, Virginia's total population, Virginia is probably, it is the most populated of the southern states, but the population of Virginia equaled the population of Delaware, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Georgia, and New Jersey all added together. And yet Virginia had one vote on any sort of legislation in that Articles of Confederation legislature. And Rhode Island, New Jersey, the other smaller states had an equal vote, but they were not representing the same numbers of people. And of course, the whole idea behind, whether we call it electoral college or whatever, the whole idea about how our representation is based on population is to, with what the Constitution will eventually do, is to find some sort of a healthy balance between large states and small states, so that small states are not determining more than they should the outcome of any piece of legislation, nor are we happy with just large states purely based because of their size than having 6 or 8 states that determine the outcome of anything that's going on. So all of that is a major, major issue. The other thing that everyone by 1786 will begin to realize, there is no president, there's no executive officer, no one really in charge. You have the Congress, which is enacting laws, but actually a precious few, because you had to have a unanimous agreement of all 13 of the states, which, that doesn't happen very often. It's hard to get 13 members in a family to agree on where to go eat dinner on Friday night, much less to get 13 states to agree on whether it's funding a toll bridge or whatever. And there's no one, once they have agreed, there's no judiciary that can say, okay, that's legal by the Constitution, nor is there anyone, an executive, to enforce what Congress has said. The truth of the matter is, that division of power, the executive branch enforces, legislature enacts laws, and the judiciary determines the constitutionality of those laws. Well, you've got 1 out of 3, so that stool is not going to stand up very long. And there was no really good way to amend the Articles of Confederation. It's kind of funny, if you read it, Article 13 basically says, and let me read you this: any alteration at any time hereafter be made of any of them, unless such alteration be agreed to in a Congress of the United States, and afterwards be confirmed by every legislature of every state. Well, that's not that different than what we're going to end up in the Constitution. But remember that for it to pass, to come out of the legislature, you got to have a unanimous vote. If we think back to last year when we were celebrating the 19th Amendment, once you had the majority vote in the House, the majority vote in the Senate, then it went to the states, and then you had to have 3/4, which is what our U.S. Constitution says. Under the Articles of Confederation, you had to have a unanimous vote of the states as represented in the Congress, and then it had to go to all of the states, and every state legislature had to basically reaffirm how their delegates had voted in the Continental Congress. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So here we are at 4:18 on a Tuesday afternoon, and we have all come to a sudden realization that we have a government in place that is basically ineffective. So we have, as so often happens in history, we had looked at Great Britain and looked at Parliament and said, they're taxing us too much. They're controlling, they're quartering troops in our homes. They have all sorts of laws about what can be carried aboard ships, and tonnage and weights and measures and all of those sorts of things. And the pendulum had gone from here, instead of finding that balance in the middle, the pendulum had gone all the way to the other side, where basically, the truth of the matter is, no one was in charge. Everyone was in charge. You just sort of look at it and you think, oh my gracious, I understand why they were so fearful of too much power and recreating a mini England in North America. But instead, they dispersed the power off to the states, and there was no balance between a central government and the states' governments. And as such, people weren't required to work together. So what will happen? Well, we know that by 1786, with Shays' Rebellion, we had earlier had the Whiskey Rebellion, some other things that had been pretty much indicative that the Articles of Confederation were not able to control things. So Alexander Hamilton, who had been one of the primary aide-de-camp, he and Lafayette had been Washington's primary aides during especially the last 3 years of the war. Hamilton, who considers himself to be a scholar, and he is, Columbia University, he went to King's College, which becomes Columbia University, and he had pored over all of the historical record. He's looking at government, he's reading the philosophers. He has sort of a gift of what today we might call a photographic memory. He would talk about being able to read things and then be able to quote them back verbatim. he realizes that the Articles of Confederation isn't going to work. So he tries to get the states to come together. He sends out letters to meet in Annapolis in early 1787. And the truth of the matter is that only a few of the states will show up, because one, who's Alexander Hamilton to call these new states together? He's doing it under the auspices of the Second Continental Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, but yet he doesn't have a role that gives him the authority to do that. It would be like me calling a meeting, inviting all the mayors of all the cities, and we're all going to talk about zoning laws or something. And of course, what would happen if I did that is exactly sort of what happened to Alexander, and it's everybody would look and go, what? Why? Who is he? Who is he to be doing this? We do know, and this is the last thing I'll tell you, that Hamilton realizes, he called that meeting for Annapolis, and Hamilton was a smart boy, impertinent at times and a little too impassioned at times, but he's a smart boy. He realizes two things real quickly. One, obviously nobody cares what he thinks or what he wants, so he will go to visit General Washington, who is retired to his home at Mount Vernon, and he will encourage the general to take the lead on restructuring the government. And of course, General Washington refuses him first and says, he pulls the line out that he had used 2 or 3 different times in public meetings. And he said, I've grown old in the service of my nation. True story. He had grown old in the service of his nation, and he really just wanted to be left alone at Mount Vernon. And Hamilton says to Washington, according to Hamilton's notes, well then, General, the Republic is doomed. If that's not the best guilt mom thing ever, I mean, that sounds like something my mother would have said when she wanted me to do something, was fine, Linda, you don't have to do it. The nation is doomed. The second thing he does is he decides Annapolis, while it is centrally located, it was the most convenient, is not where they should meet. He decides they're going back to Philadelphia. He wants those delegates from those states to sit in the same hall, to sit in the chairs where some of them had sat, where others from their state had sat when they had authored the Declaration of Independence, when they had heard the bells toll for freedom, when Yorktown was victorious. He's really good at the emotional game, and he is successful. That meeting will be called for September of 1787, and 12 of the 13 states will be there present when it begins. Georgia's always late arriving because they have such a long distance, and quite frankly, the frontier was still difficult to get all the way up, but they will get there a few days later. And they come together, the purpose being Washington's letter to the delegations from each of the 13 states was calling them together to revise the Articles of Confederation. It became very clear within the first week that there was so much that needed to be changed that the easiest thing to do was just simply to rip the Articles of Confederation up and start over again. And that's where we'll start over with the government next week and sort of take a look at the major points of the U.S. Constitution. I would encourage you, if you don't have a handy dandy pocket Constitution, let me know. I'll send you one. I feel like it, sort of like I feel about my Bible or whatever. You should always have one of each in the glove compartment of your car. You never know when you're going to slide into a ditch or when someone will challenge you. And I like to be able to whip my Constitution or my Articles of Faith out and be able to find the true answer. Interestingly, one of the things you'll find in the press lots of times is that people will quote things as being in the Constitution that are actually Old Testament scriptures. Every so often I have to go, not in the Constitution, not in the Constitution, that's in Exodus. But there's a little bit of confusion about the giving of the law altogether. So next week we will put together the U.S. Constitution, and then we'll march into those early days of the Republic. And guess what? Poor George Washington, who is going to, preside at the Constitutional Convention, doesn't get to go back home to Virginia and farm, yet once again, he will be sort of commandeered into service to his nation. So, this is a good week when we think about Veterans Day being on Thursday, to think about those in your family that have served in our armed forces, and to think back, from the beginning, from the French and Indian War through the American Revolution, up through the War of 1812, the Mexican War, all the way up through until current day, the courage and the belief in the greater good that propels men and women to step forward. So, I hope all of you will in some way commemorate Veterans Day and say thank you to those veterans in your family and among your friends. And it's 4:26, and I'd like to point out, Jennifer, that I hushed before 4:30. And you're muted this time.
Thank you, Linda.
Did anybody have any real quick questions real quick?
Yeah.
We've got like 2 minutes. No?
How many of you know that you had Revolutionary War patriots here during that period of time? Of course, a lot of you are off screen and everything. I encourage you. It's so much fun. I think the inherent questions that we as humans have is, where did I come from and why am I here? And I do believe that being able to do that research and being able to sort of see where your ancestors were in it, especially at critical points in our history, makes all of it that much more lively and makes it all that much more lively and alive for us. Knowing that I had someone at Cowpens, knowing that I had someone in the Mexican War. I didn't, Tony did, but knowing those sorts of things makes it also real. And Anne, I will help you find your ancestors. That's what I love doing, and that's what I do in the middle of the night from about 1:30 until 4. I am digging up dead bones and finding those connections. That's when I do my genealogy, because I can't sleep. I've done two sets of Finding Patriots actually since Saturday for friends, so that now they can go ahead and decide what they want to do with it. But it's just, there's something wonderful about knowing from whence you come. Mm-hmm. And then you can figure it all out. So thank you all for being here today. Find your handy dandy copy of the Constitution and have it in hand next week when we come back together, because we're going to talk sort of about the compromises, some good, some bad. The wonderful thing about this history is we try to be very truthful, and we have great and shining stellar moments. And then we have those moments where we look and we go, well, shucky darn, why did you all do that? Why didn't you deal with that issue instead of saying, we're not going to deal with the issue of slavery, but we're going to postpone that decision until 1818, the assumption being most of the people who were deciding would be dead and it won't be my problem. Don't you just love it when people kind of kick that can on down the road? But we'll talk about all of that next week and have great fun. And Susan, I see your thing. If you will message me, I will send you a pocket Constitution. I might have, courtesy of one of my great friends who publishes lots and lots of pocket Constitutions. I have several hundred in my garage that I hand out in the schools. I'm trying to convince young people they need to have one in their backpacks at all times. So Susan, if you'll give me an address or tell me somewhere that you are, I will leave you Constitutions to pick up for everybody in your family.
You want
Linda, I need one.
Oh, yay. I will send. I will send. I can find you.
Yeah, okay.
Therefore, you can give Edgar and other folks one too. Everybody needs a Constitution.
I know Ed doesn't.
Do you want to give people your email address?
Oh, so that would be the easiest way is if you'll email me, and my email address is easy to remember. It is all lowercase, local history counts, COUNTS, no spaces, just local history counts @gmail.com. And I will see that you get Constitutions. You know, there has been off and on over the last 25 years or so an attempt to modify U.S. history as it's taught and to not start U.S. history until the 1870s. And my major problem with that is it takes away the Revolutionary War, but it takes away constitutional foundations. And if we don't know our rights coupled with our responsibilities, then we don't know when our rights are being violated, and we don't know what our role as active, engaged citizens are. So I'm a huge proponent of knowing Constitution. So that'll be my last plug. And here we are. My clock says 4:30.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for today. And thank you very much, Linda, for doing this today. And thank you all for attending. And we hope to see you all next week. So with that, we'll see you later.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you so much. I've had a blast. Love talking history. See you all next week.
Bye-bye.